Hey, what is up everyone? This is Lucas. I'm coming back with another tutorial. This one's going to be dedicated to Flambient, which is quite a controversial word in the industry, but I do like this technique a lot. I've developed a little bit of a different approach to the technique throughout the years, and hopefully I can explain it to you and give you my thought process on how I go about blending photos with that technique. And by the way, as usual, I'll be using my pen for editing. So here we are in Lightroom, and what I did, I've actually selected the photographs already. So I've pre-selected them so we don't have to waste too much time on that. I do have here our ambient frame, and this is the main frame I'm going to use as a base. Then if we go to the next two frames, as you can see, they're basically ambient frames, but much darker. Then we have our main flash layer, really quite bright, but again, I'm using Sony a7 III. The dynamic range is quite good. We're gonna drop it down a little bit and it'll be fine. And again, I have two extra frames. So first thing I want to do is basically go through our basic editing process. We're just gonna start with our ambient frame. I'm gonna leave the profile on Adobe Color. If you want, you can use a flat profile, which gives you a little bit more of a dynamic range. I'm not too bothered right now, so I'm just gonna leave it as it is. And looking at the overall exposure, it's a little bit bright, so I'm just going to drop it a little bit, and I'm using the histogram here on the top. You can also obviously use the exposure bar here as well. Next, we want to drop our highlights, trying to recover some of those. We're going to increase the shadows. And why I'm dropping the highlights, increasing the shadows, that basically stretches the dynamic range. So we see more of the darks and more of the brights. And this is basically what we want to do for real estate photography. Really, any real estate agents, as you know, probably loves bright photographs. So as much as you might hate the look, this is what the real estate agents want. So most of the time, you'll be trying to make the photos as bright as possible. Going back to the tutorial, going to raise our whites just a little bit and then drop the blacks, just to create a little bit more contrast. I could potentially raise the clarity, which increases the contrast in the mids, but I'm just going to leave it as it is. If we jump down here, we have the color grading, and we actually have midtones here as well. If your image is a little bit dark, you can use that to actually just concentrate on the midtones and raise the midtones here a little bit. So as you can see, it works pretty well. So I'm just going to raise it a little bit. And then going down, we're at sharpening. I don't typically do much here. We can raise it maybe to 60, and I'll just press Alt and adjust masking with my mouse button to somewhere where I feel it's okay. The areas in white will be the ones that will be sharpened. So I kind of like it maybe here. If we go down, I'm going to remove chromatic aberrations, and the profile is already enabled automatically for me. So this is basic editing done on the photo here. Let's press Shift and select rest of the images. I'm going to press Sync. Let's check all, and I'm going to synchronize. I haven't changed the white balance, so it was set as shot, so it's not going to change the white balance. This was our ambient frame. This is what we're going to use. And we need our flash frame, which is this one here. So let's make little adjustments here. I think it's still a little bit bright, so I'm just going to drop the exposure a little bit. Apart from that, it looks pretty okay. I'm going to press W for the white balance selector, and I'm just going to adjust the white balance a little bit. Try and find a spot that's going to give us pretty good look. And I think it's okay around here. Apart from that, I'm not going to do anything else really. So these two frames here, I'm just going to mark them with red color. This is our basic Flambient if we want. Why a lot of Flambients are being looked at as looking bad is typically because you can see shadows that really shouldn't be there generated by the flash layer. And for that, you can work on that a little bit and try and mimic the natural light. So for example, in this image here, we have the window on the left-hand side. And as you can see, the light is coming through this way. The shadows are going basically from left to right. Now, if you look at our flash layer, The shadows are going opposite direction because the flash is located behind the camera. The shadow here is going from right to left, more or less, and that basically looks unnatural. And that's going to create a little bit of a problem as well when we try and blend ambient layer with flash. And the other thing is that it gives you a very flat look. As you can see, there's really no shadows. If you have the light coming from the window, if we look at our ambient layer, as you can see, for example, pillows here, anything that faces the camera here is more in shadow because the light obviously hits these sides of the pillows and so on. So the other sides remaining in shadow. But if we use the flash just behind the camera, it lights up everything kind of evenly. And that creates what it is basically looked upon as a very flat look. We can use other flash frames to try and create shadows more consistent with what the natural source of light is. In this case, we have the window here. If I step closer to the window, so kind of try and emit the flash from kind of the area where the window is, the light's going to fall off in a very similar fashion. As you can see even here, the shadow generated by the fireplace here is going from left to right, going kind of this way. And then I have flash that I've taken on the other side, so that creates also shadow coming from left to right. And as you can see here as well, where we have this table, it's going this way. So, we're trying to mimic a little bit of the shadow here, and that's basically what we're trying to do with the flash layers. Obviously, it's not going to be exactly the same because the light will be coming from a little bit of different angles, but we can make it look very similar. And then if we blend it with the natural ambient light layer, it looks much, much better. I'm going to select our flash layer and shift click to select the other flash layers. And I'm going to sync it, including the white balance. I want it to be the same across the photos. As you can see, we have a little bit of more contrast. There's a little bit more dark and bright areas compared to very flat, evenly lit flash coming from behind the camera. For the ambient layer, I've taken two other ones here. These are here basically to try and enhance our ambient layer a little bit. Again, this is something that you don't really need to do. I use the other layers to blend it into one ambient layer, hopefully giving us a little bit more highlights and a little bit more shadows by blending these using the luminosity masks. So with that said, let's just make a little bit of adjustments to these layers. I'm going to add a little bit more shadow, or recover a little bit more shadow, and raise the black point a little bit. And I'll do the same on this one here. So this is the darkest frame. I'm going to drop the highlights a little bit. So let's grab all these photos and send them to Photoshop. Select everything, right click, go edit in, and select open as layers in Photoshop. First, let's try and rename everything so we know which layer does what. So the top layer here is our ambient layer. And I'm going to put mid because, actually this is, let's call it high. It's going to be the high exposure. That's another ambient, and that's going to be mid. And that's another ambient, and I'll just call it low. Then we have our flash. I'll call it base. Let's call it flash right and flash left. Okay, so I'm going to put our flash base on the bottom, and actually I'm going to duplicate it so we can use it later for our other example. And then we have our ambient. Again, I'm gonna duplicate it. I'm gonna use it later on. So let's go and drop our ambient just above the flash. So the basic idea of Flambient is combining ambient layer, which is our natural light layer, with the flash layer underneath. The way we achieve it is by changing blending mode of our ambient layer to luminosity, which basically takes only the light information from our ambient layer and disregards color. And as we can see, the image looks much better already. And that's with luminosity and opacity at 100%. And it still looks pretty decent. We can start dropping the opacity and kind of put more flash forward, or we can increase opacity and put more of our ambient layer back in. To be honest, this looks quite good with the opacity quite high, or maybe even at 100% is pretty okay. Nathan Cool, for example, likes to set the ambient layer at 50%, but in our example here, it looks pretty decent at 100%, so I think we'll drop it maybe to around 80. The other thing we might want to do, for example, if we look at our flash layer, we can see a little bit more out the window. If I enable luminosity, you can see it blows it up. Sometimes it's a good look, especially if there's nothing to be viewed out the window. But here I would like to reveal our window a little bit. So for that, I'm going to be using a mask, and we're going to press the button here. It's going to create a white mask, and then we can change our brush, making sure that it's a very soft brush. Let's change it to black color, and I'm going to remove these parts of the ambient layer here. This is the basic idea of Flambient. Now there are certain things we can do to try and make it better. All the color is taken from our flash layer, and as you can see, there's two things that are kind of bothering me here. One is because our shadows are not matching, so our flash layer here created a shadow here, but our ambient layer doesn't have a shadow in this area, so it creates this kind of orange-brown area here, which looks quite bad. So that's one thing we need to fix. If I zoom in here again, you see there's a shadow from the flash that's causing another kind of problem here. And then in general, I want to get our walls or the white areas looking a little bit more white. So remove some of the orange that's being cast back from the flooring and some of the blue as well. Let's disable our ambient layer. To tackle our color issues, I'm going to go to our adjustment layers. And let's find hue saturation. Next, let's go to the select menu and click on color range. And this tool allows me to select different colors within the image and make a selection out of them. So anywhere I click, you can see where it selects the color is colored in white. And then red is anything that's not selected. And I've also got a little preview here in the window. Now, I do have something called localized color clusters selected. If I actually enable it, as you can see, it only selects the color in an area where I've clicked. If I untick it, it basically selects that color anywhere in the image. So it doesn't matter how far away from my selection the color is. If it's within the same color, it selects it. In this situation, to be honest, it won't do much difference, but I typically prefer to leave it on. So for example, if I'm just doing the ceiling, I can quickly have only the areas around ceiling selected. And you can control how far from the color you've selected it can actually see by using the range sliders. If I change it to 100, as you can see, it just basically selects from the whole image. So I'm just gonna drop it down a little bit. And fuzziness is our threshold slider. So if I increase the fuzziness, it finds more colors within the same range. I like to keep it a little bit lower. We want to have a pretty decent selection on the color. And now that I've selected this one, if I press and hold Shift, I can start adding to my selection. So let's add the other areas that are supposed to be white in the image. So the walls around here. And I'm not worried too much about it selecting some areas that I don't really want. I can kind of work on that a little bit later on. And I can even select those shadows that were created by Flash. And this is why I like the color range. As you can see, those legs of this little table were not selected. They're in red. Even though there's some orange and yellow and red in the discoloration on the ceiling, it didn't mark the orange color coming from the lights as much. So I really like this tool. Now the thing is, if I'm going to press OK, it will automatically add the selection to the mask of our hue saturation. Now I can easily adjust just the areas we've done. So what I'm going to do is drop the opacity, or drop the saturation, sorry, on that down to somewhere around 25-30%, I think. Okay, I think we're going to leave it there. If you want to remove some of the areas, for example, if it's selected something that you don't really want, you can actually use the mask here and kind of change it. But what I would suggest is putting that adjustment layer inside a group. So I press Ctrl G. Let's let's name it whites, for example. And I can add another mask onto it. And now by using the brush, I'll change the color to black. I can remove anything around the areas which I don't want to be affected. So we've kind of fixed our problem areas. We've still have a little bit of the problem with the shadow here, just because shadow in the ambient layer doesn't exist. But if you look at the rest of the image, it looks pretty decent. Now for this shadow, again, there's two options. We could potentially just put our hue saturation layer on top. And as you can see, it definitely changes it here. If you want, you can do even more. So we could put another adjustment layer for hue saturation, go back into select, color range, and we can select those areas here again, just to be a little bit more specific on this area. I'm going to press OK, and let's drop that even more and do similar trick as the last time. So I'm just going to put it in the group. Let's call it whites again. I'm going to add the mask. Let's invert actually the mask so it kind of removes it, because I know it selected some other areas. I just really want to affect here around the table. So let's change the color to white and gently paint it in. And as you can see, that removed that. And then we had one problem area here. So I'm just going to paint that in here a little bit. And here we go. That looks pretty decent. So one more other thing I'd like to do is basically bring back a little bit of the orange or a warm glow coming from the lights. So if we go to the hue saturation adjustment above our flash frame, I'm just going to zoom in on the lights here a little bit. And let's change our brush to black. And I'm just going to remove some of that hue saturation adjustment from here. Okay, perfect. So let's now select all these layers and I'll call it blend 1. Okay, let's go into the second part of this, which is creating just a little bit of a more accurate Flambient. So we have our base flash layer here. Now we're going to add on top of it the other two here. So the first one, let's select that and create a black mask. So if I press and hold Alt and click on the mask, it's going to basically hide the image. And now we're going to bring those areas here a little bit. I'm going to try and avoid the mirror here. So obviously I don't want to get myself in the mirror. And then let's do very similar thing for this one here. So Alt, click on the mask, and we're going to paint in, see these shadows here a little bit. It's going to brighten this area. And maybe darken this area a little bit because it's further away from the window, just to kind of give it a little bit more natural look. Yeah, this is basically it. So if I shift click all the layers here, I'll press Ctrl G, I'll call it flash. So that's going to put it in the group. And now what we can actually do is copy our hue saturation adjustment layer that we did already, since we did all the color range selection and everything like that. So I'm just gonna press Ctrl J, which is going to copy it, and I'm going to put it above our flash. So that changes quite a bit here. Okay, I think it looks pretty good. All right, so let's work on our ambient layers now. I'm gonna use luminosity masking to try and balance them a little bit better. Let's use our mid exposure, even though this one is a little bit dark for mid exposure, but I'm going to kind of assume that this is our mid exposure here. Let's put a black mask on the dark exposure and the bright. And normally I use Lumencia. I've got Raya Pro as well and TK panel, but if you don't have one, we can do that pretty much manually. If you go to channels, you have your RGB, red, green, and blue channels. If you press Control and click on, let's say, RGB, it's going to make a selection of the brightest pixels. And you can kind of experiment with RGB, red, green, and blue channels and see which one kind of works best for you. I'm just going to stick to RGB. If you're going to press Ctrl-Shift-Alt and click again, it's going to constrain the selection even more. So now I'm going to go back, get our paint bucket tool, and I'm just going to click. And as you can see, it's added our selection here. Now we want to brighten up the dark areas. So I'm just going to remove the visibility on our dark layer, go back to channels, control click on RGB, go back to layers. I've got my black layer for the brightest natural light layer selected. And then I'm going to press Control I. That's going to basically invert the selection we made on RGB channel and apply the mask. And as you can see, it brightened up a lot here. So if I press and hold Alt and click on the visibility of our mid exposure, you can see the difference before and after with the blended layers. If you want, you can actually manually start painting in the areas here. So this, for example, we can maybe change the flow to maybe 10, and I can kind of tap the areas here to add a little bit more of that brighter layer here on top. So you don't have to stick to any luminosity masking. You can actually do this stuff manually and select which areas you want to brighten. Now that we have everything blended together, let's shift select all of them, press Ctrl G, and I'm going to call it Ambient. And now that group is going to be basically treated as a single frame. So let's change the blending mode to luminosity. Let's drop it as with the other one to 80%. So this is our blend here. We have few little things to fix because, you know, this shadow here is still not exactly matching the ambient. You can see a little bit of a discoloration here. It's definitely much better because this is a more softer shadow. This is another plus if you select to add a little bit of different flash pops here and there to try and mimic the natural light, because the shadows typically will be much softer, especially if you hold your flash lower, so not all the way up to the ceiling, but a little bit lower is going to create softer shadows. So as you can see, the discoloration is not too bad. We could potentially just leave it as it is, or we can go to hue saturation, get our color range selection, and then let's add these areas. And I'm going to add this one here as well. Let's press OK. Let's drop it. You see, we don't even need to drop it a lot for it to disappear and blend with the rest. That's pretty okay. I'm going to add it into a group. Let's call it whites again. I'm going to create a black mask to hide it and change my brush to white. And I'm just gonna gently paint it in. It's the flow, it's still at 10%, so I'm just changing it to 20. And you see we have a little bit of a difference. Not much, but it's enough to blend just there. If I alt-click on our first layer, you can see it's much, much brighter. Typically, as I said, it's something that probably the real estate agents will prefer much more. If you look at the pillows here, you can see how brighter they are, and this area here. And if I go back, you can see how much more shadows we have, more contrast in the image. Now, if we go to ambient, we can go to adjustment layers, select curves, and we can clip it either by going in between both layers, pressing Alt and clicking, or using the clip button here. And then I can raise our midtones here a little bit. If you want to create more contrast, we can also raise the white. To top it all off, let's go and grab the mask we did on our ambient layer here. So the one that we basically just removed the windows. So I'm going to press Alt and drag the mask to our ambient. And as you can see, it now removed the window from that selection. So actually, let's put now all this and rename it Blend 2. You can decide what you prefer. I actually prefer this second one we did. There's not that much difference, but it feels natural to me. Looking at this thing as well, typically orange colors get really saturated a lot. So another thing we could do, and this can be just on top of both layers really, we don't care. We can go to hue saturation. I'm actually going to use the picker tool, click here. It's going to select yellows and I'm going to drop them a little bit, just so it's a little bit more natural. Okay, so I've added some final adjustments in Lightroom. I've corrected some verticals a little bit and I'm going to try and put both of the images on the screen. Again, the photo is nothing spectacular, but it was just to really present my thought process for editing Flambient photographs. As I said, in the simplest form, it's basically two frames. One is ambient, which is natural light, the other one's flash, and you blend them together. The only problem is that if your flash layer actually has a lot of hard shadows that are visible, they'll be facing the wrong way if you're shooting from behind the camera to light up everything. As a professional photographer, you probably want to deliver the photographs that your real estate agent wants. But as you develop your style and your taste, and possibly moving into different areas of photography like architecture, design, we see those photographs and start to realize that really they don't look that great. I mean, don't get me wrong, as I said, it works definitely for real estate agents. They love photographs that blast everything in light. But again, if you want to create some feeling, some drama, some depth to the photo, you have to start looking a little bit more into creating interesting play between shadows and lights. That's why I think it's very important to work on your style, to work on your techniques and being able to adjust to different situations. Thanks for watching the video and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.